Hi, it's Richard here from Intelligent Advisor IT Consulting with another in our regular series about the example projects of Oracle Policy Modeling. I'm doing this call from a train, so I'm just going to fade out gracefully and you won't have to watch me staring out the window. So this week's project is called Insurance Picker. And Insurance Picker, if I scroll down through the example projects, you'll see right here, obviously is part of the modeling for the insurance industry, but there are a couple of key features, one of which is the second project we've seen which has a mapping to B2C service, and obviously this affects some of how the OPM works, notably the value lists. It also generates forms for you using the Oracle Analytics Publisher Desktop, and has a bunch of other cool things hiding away in there that we're going to look at. So I'm going to download, or rather install a brand new copy of Insurance Picker. And let's take a little bit of a ride through the project, looking at how it works, but also where we can learn from it and where we can create new additions and so forth. So the mapping is evident because you can see that the two entities present here have been mapped to entities in Oracle B2C service, including the second one here you can see is an italics, which means it's an inferred entity. So we are going to generate tasks which are going to be sent back into Oracle B2C service, and you can see that those pieces of information are mapped out. So that's how you can tell that this data is going somewhere. And mapped out but not mapped in tells us that, well, it's created in Intelligent Advisor and sent out into, in this case, Oracle B2C service. The global entity is mapped out as well. You can see that we've mapped out the first name, the last name, and the email as the primary key. So we're going to offer the user of our interview the possibility of creating themselves in our system. You can also switch over to the output and input, in our case the output mapping button, and review the output mapping in a slightly different way. You can see whichever ones are checked are the ones that have been output mapped, and they have on the left the fields from Oracle B2C service, and on the right the attribute in Intelligent Advisor that corresponds to it. So there's the attribute that this corresponds to. And of course you could click more and add new attributes if that was your requirement. And you can switch over to the other entity and perform the same task. The reason it's useful to come in here is because you can see the little star that tells you when something is required. So if you're going to be doing an outbound mapping, well, it's best to know what's required by the external system before you start. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the mapping of this standard project. I'm going to switch back to the standard entity structure before going into the data mapping dialog. Of course, this dialog changes depending on the kind of application you have behind Intelligent Advisor. This is the Oracle B2C service specific mapping window, and you can see that there are up to 3 different ways to access this interview. And this is currently set to be an anonymous interview, meaning you don't need to log into a customer portal, you don't need to log into any kind of agent desktop. Anybody who has access to the URL of this interview, even if it's embedded in some other application or some other website, will be able to take part in it. When they've finished it, we will record them and create a new contact, and we will be able to create any child objects, including the task that I just mentioned. If you were using this as a learning tool, you could of course just switch off the mapping if you wanted, but you would probably lose a bit of interest. So I'm going to keep the mapping here, even though I'm not going to demonstrate it connecting to Oracle B2C service. And naturally enough, when you're doing this in real life, you'd need to make sure that you change the mapping to whatever name you'd given to your own Oracle B2C service instance. So now that we've talked a little bit about how this interview is output mapped into Oracle B2C service, let's just run it and focus a little more on the business side of things. What is this project? What is this interview actually going to do? And as you can see, it's a fairly standard approach. We have a custom header, which you can just move that over, make it a bit bigger. So we can see that in the styles dialog, someone has changed the custom header. We're using the screen navigation tools, and will show you how to remove that if you don't want it. And we have one basic question at the beginning is, who are you? So this you can probably imagine is a value list with some images associated with it. And then we choose what insurance extras we would like. I'm going to choose a few here, dental amongst others. And then we are asked a specific question relating to dental cover. Do we expect to do any major work? And we get ourselves a response. Here is the estimated premium, and here is a summary of your benefits. The benefits summary is interesting because the benefits summary is a Oracle Analytics Publisher file, which I'll show you where it's generated in Intelligent Advisor in a minute, but it's provided to us in the form of an RTF file. So it's provided in a Word file. Normally we'd expect to see this as a PDF. The reason behind this, I suppose, is that this could then be edited and personalized to make it even more appropriate for the person, or it could just be to show us and remind us that when you have a form such as this in Intelligent Advisor, it doesn't always have to be presented as a PDF to the end consumer. So let's go back in and debug one more time. And let's have a look at our data. As you can see, we can have the global entity and, of course, the contacts tasks entity. And we are going to need to carry on and finish this and enter the first name and last name in order to be sure that we've entered all the data we need, potentially to save us in the B2C service, but of course in the debugger that's not going to happen, but also potentially to make sure that all the data that is needed to create tasks for us is actually populated. So I'll click the submit button. It won't submit, but it will behave as if it had. So let's go back into the data tab and see what we've got. We've got our global with our details of our contact, and if I expand, you can see here that there's a bunch of other things, such as this is the kind of insurance I wanted, but I also have a task. A task has been inferred based on my choices, so this is a record that will be sent into the task table in Oracle B2C Service if we were to hook this up to a real Oracle B2C Service instance. So let's take a look at how the task is inferred. How is the task created? So I went into relationship usage and up popped this Word document. So if you've never come across this before, this is an interesting learning experience. So you can see here that we have a table, and it looks just like a normal table with a couple of exceptions. The first exception is if you compare it to the table underneath, there's no otherwise. And the first line, which typically is a conclusion, is actually a relationship. So that's how you can spot easily that this table isn't just a standard table, it's a table that is used to infer instances of an entity, and they're going to be members of the relationship called the contacts tasks. So what I could do here is I'm going to duplicate this line, and I'm going to add something silly here. I'm going to add a bit more text to the second one, and I'm going to let's add another criteria. Okay, so I'm going to create a new criteria here, and I'm going to ask the user for some more information. I don't know what it is. Let's call it something silly like the extra info. So I've got two contact tasks in this table now, and I will just minimize that for a second and go back to Oracle Policy Modeling and make sure that I find a good place, how about here, that'll do, to actually then leverage the attribute that I just added. So are the extras required? I have no idea what that means, but you get the idea. It's a Boolean that I'm going to ask you about if you're interested in my products. So let's make them buttons just like the other ones were, and we'll relaunch our debugger. And now, when we go in here, I'll come back. Sorry, I need to come all the way back. And I need to say, yes, I want the extras, which was my new attribute. And then we'll go right to the end, just for completion's sake. You didn't really need to do that. But now you can see that I have two tasks that have been instantiated, two tasks that have been inferred because I created two lines here, and the second one met my criteria. You'll notice that unlike a normal table, it actually did create them both. So if I wanted to exclude the first one and only do the second one, I'll have to make sure that the conditions mean that the first line doesn't apply. So if I now refresh my debugger, you can see that I've created a second. So I've only created one task, and it's the task that contains my secondary text. It's there. So that's an interesting one. So if you've never seen that before, this is an inference table in Word with a relationship up top and no otherwise line. And it leverages the containment relationship to generate tasks for the contact. So that's well worth spending a little time on if you're new to Oracle Intelligent Advisor inferred instances and relationships. You can see here that when I look at the task has an identifying attribute called the task, So just from a technical perspective, it means that when you are working in your Word table, in the Word table, you're actually filling in, you're actually entering data into the task identifying attribute. So if you then need to fill in the other attributes, such as the task description, you will need to handle those in either standard rules, or in this case you can see in a standard table. So the task description is just inferring an attribute like you would normally do. So given that I have now added a new attribute, I'm going to make two choices here, one of which is negative and one of which is positive, based on my new attribute. And I'm going to change the text a little bit so that I can recognize when my task description is used and when the traditional original task description is used. So this is a great example of two kinds of table working together. At the top we have our inference table that generates the records, if you will, and then we have the task description, which is the standard table that I'm using to swap out the standard description and replace it with a different one. So a nice example of these two kinds of tables working together. So I'll redebug. When I look at my task at the moment and I look at the task description, you can see that it includes that extra bit of blurb that I put in. If I now return to the interview and say that I don't need my special extra stuff, and I return to data, you'll see that I have only one task, and it's the original task with the original description. So it's a great example of using an inference table and a standard table together to infer instances and then to populate one of the attributes. Excellent. So what else is in store for us in this wonderful project, which is great for learning? Well, as I mentioned earlier, you've noticed that they've changed the background image for the header. And I'm going to show you there, you can remove that funny little drop-down screen list thing. There he goes. I find it a little irritating most of the time, but that's just me. So now I have no screen list appearing. And what else do I need to show you? Well, I'll minimize this for a second. And we'll go into forms, just to remind us that there's a form being generated here and available on the last screen. So if you want to look at that form and make changes to it, you will be able to open it, but to be able to open it, you'll need to install Oracle Analytics Publisher Desktop. And we'll talk about that in just a second. You can see the format is pretty straightforward. If you've ever done any kind of mail merge, that should be pretty obvious. You know, it's not complicated. So in my case, you may remember I added an attribute a minute ago, and if I want to use that in my form, I'm going to have to give it a technical name. So that's a good thing to remember, that anything you want to show in a form, you need to give it a technical name. And then I'll go back to the form and I'll open it up. And if I haven't already done so, I would need to use that little download link you can see to download Oracle Analytics Publisher Desktop. And I'll let you go through that if you haven't done it already. And once I'm in here, I can come down to a sensible place. I don't know where exactly. This will do. I'll just put it at the bottom. And I can switch to the new Publisher tab, open the sample XML, and navigate into the folder of the project, and go find in the folder of the project, there's the form templates, my language, my region code rather, and there's this file that I have to load. And when I've loaded this, I can then display, or I can use all these buttons, or I can simply click field to see a list of fields. And if I scroll down, I should be able to see the field that I actually added just a minute ago. There it is. I'm going to add both of these into my Word document. I can just double click them, or I can drag and drop like this. And I'll put a carriage return between them so that it's a little easier to read. And I'm going to demonstrate to you what the difference is between these two. You've got one called text and one called value. So I'll put a little bit of static text in here so we'll be able to distinguish them in a minute. And there we go. And I'll save the file, close the file, and we'll go back to the interview and we will regenerate the form. Because this is an Oracle Analytics Publisher Desktop form, you don't need to validate or compile anything. You just need to close it and then apply the changes to the debugger or reinitialize the debugger. There we go. So I'll go all the way through here. There we go. And there we go. And you'll notice that I jump over this screen. If I want to go back to the dental screen, I need to actually say I want dental cover, or I can cheat like I just did. And let's go over here and open up the form, which is being delivered in RTF format, as I mentioned earlier. And here comes the RTF page. And if we scroll down now, right at the bottom, we should see my two new elements. So the first one, which is called the text, is actually the language text, and the second one is actually the pure value. So if you're building a Oracle Analytics Publisher desktop file for Intelligent Advisor, choose wisely. Make sure you choose the value or the text depending on what you want. I just mentioned a minute ago that this screen uses dynamic visibility. If you don't choose dental, the screen doesn't display by default, so you could play with that, I suppose, and have other screens that only get displayed when certain choices are made. Back to the Data tab one last time. Sorry, back to the Rules tab. Let's take a quick walk through the other files. One of the interesting and slightly unusual things about this project is that almost everything is derived out of tables in Word. The one exception being these basic setups for calculating the premiums and calculating or understanding the type of products that you're interested in. Almost all the other pages, I'll probably be contradicted now, but if I look at the other files, yeah, most of them are pretty word heavy. Nothing wrong with that at all, just interesting. The create email document is empty, so you don't need to waste your time going in there. And let's go into the create. Yeah, you see, a lot of tables here used to deal with multiple different scenarios, and that's how you could certainly extend this by adding further scenarios. The exceptions being things like calculating the numeric value of the premium and then displaying it as text. That about wraps it up for our whistle-stop tour of Insurance Picker. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you again soon for another one. Take care.